on tight and it'll be okay. We will overcome.
Working in partnership to deliver solutions that work for children and families. Hello again, and thank you for joining me for the last in our series of groundbreaking webinars on child crime. It's been an interesting journey, even if some of the information, facts, and case studies shared have been difficult to hear or comprehend. Having experienced the work of Embrace CVOC over the years at Bedfordshire Police and being part of the Force fundraising team, it's been my absolute pleasure to introduce the webinars and our speaker panels. Today, we're concentrating on the work that's being done to improve the support for children and their families after the worst has happened. I know the great work that the team at Embrace does. It truly is transformational. But before I introduce our panel, there are some housekeeping points. At the bottom of your screen are multiple application engagement tools you can use. All the tools are resizable and movable, so please feel free to move them around. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. If you have any questions for our speakers during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A engagement tool. We'll try to answer these in a panel session at the end of the presentations with Embrace's Chief Executive, Anne Campbell. But if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. Please know we do capture all questions and your feedback is really important to us. A copy of today's slide deck and additional help materials are available in the resource list. We encourage you to download any resources or links that you may find useful. For the best viewing experience, we recommend using a wired internet connection, closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background that could cause issues. Webinars are bandwidth intensive, so closing any unnecessary browser tabs will help conserve your bandwidth. The webinar is being streamed through your computer, so there is a no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your computer speakers or headset are turned on and the volume is up so you can hear the presenters. Some networks cause slides to advance more slowly than others, so logging off your VPN is recommended. If your slides are behind, pushing F5 on your keyboard will refresh the page. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help Engagement tool at the bottom of your screen. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available approximately 1 day after the webcast and can be accessed using the same audience link that you used to access this session. So back to today's presenters. We're very pleased to welcome the Victims Commissioner, Dame Vera Baird, who was at one time a serving police and crime commissioner. Dame Vera has instigated some groundbreaking research and work during her tenure, particularly around domestic abuse and sexual violence. She's followed by NICOLA LESTER, a psychological trauma specialist who understands the effects of trauma on children and young people. NICOLA supported some of the Manchester Arena terrorist victims. You've already met Anne Campbell, the CEO of Embrace, who has facilitated your questions. Now we get an opportunity to hear how Embrace is developing its services to provide the support which makes a difference to young victims and witnesses of crime. Our final speaker, Claire Johnbolkas, will discuss the Criminal Injury Compensation Scheme. Claire is a senior litigation executive from Slater and Gordon. Your questions will be taken at the end. Thank you.
Hello everybody, I'm Vera Baird, the Victims Commissioner for England and Wales. I'm very pleased to be asked to take part in this series of webinars being organised by Embrace. Embrace is a charity I haven't worked with before, but I am very impressed by what I have heard. The insight into how victimisation affects children and young people, the ability to provide personal support of an emotional kind, of a specialist kind, and I think the whole kind of atmosphere of the organisation summed up with the cheer up kind of support that its website also says that it offers. I want to tell you 3 things about the work that I've been doing that's relevant to Embrace's work. And the first thing is about a piece of work we did last April, a report about the impact of domestic abuse on children. My understanding is that it's very likely that not only Embrace, but also the other children's charities who do similar work receive more children referrals from domestic abuse and sexual violence than anything else. This is the most fundamentally undermining kind of criminal victimization, and it's imperative that children get excellent support so that it doesn't defer their development absolutely any more than it need do at a minimum level. So we did a report about the impact of domestic violence on young people. Before I tell you a little bit about it, I want to tell you the tiniest bit about my job. I'm the Victims Commissioner. This is not a post that's particularly well known. My job is to promote the interests of victims and witnesses, to encourage best practice for victims and witnesses, and to keep the Victims Code under review. That third is the Criminal Justice Code, which I do try to keep under review. But if I were presenting now a slideshow about what the Victims Commissioner does, slide 2, following the obligations I've just set out, would be my powers, and it will be empty because I don't have any powers. Those duties are ones that I must try to achieve, and of course I have therefore to make axes. I have to link in with victims to understand what their needs are. I have to lobby. I was a minister in the Labour government myself, and I'm a criminal QC, so I can talk perhaps to very important people face to face because of that experience. But there is no power for me to drive home the interests of victims and witnesses. And so we do try to make real progress, not only by lobbying, as I've described, but also by looking in depth at how particular sectors of victims and witnesses are faring and making reports that add to the knowledge about that sector. And that's where this report about children and the impact of domestic abuse comes in. It's intended to influence policy making. So we produced it, and it's called Sowing the Seeds. And it's about the complex impact of domestic abuse on children. But what is very, very clear is that the impact is significant and is very far-reaching. And you'll recall that before we had the current scourge of COVID-19, we had an earlier scourge, as it was being referred to, of an increase in gang violence, an increase in knife crime, sometimes appalling violence inflicted by child or young person on child and young person, the development of county lines which pulls young people into dangerous criminality. We found an overlap between that kind of criminality and the impact of domestic abuse. We're not talking about necessarily something causal, but an overlap in itself is quite significant. We found that a quarter of young people, according to the people we were talking to, who had unacceptable behaviour, also had their own concerns about domestic abuse of a carer or of a parent. Practitioners who deal with young people in gangs say that children experiencing domestic abuse can easily tend to look for a family elsewhere. And that can make them vulnerable, of course, to sexual exploitation and to criminal exploitation. And it is no surprise that the police at the highest levels are now considering that they should deal with the exploitation of children as to either sort. That is to say, they should focus on the exploitation of children, whether they become criminals or whether they become victims. And that is a very important further point we found which is that currently the criminal justice system doesn't know how to react to children who are victims of domestic abuse and at the same time have engaged in criminal behaviour. We also found that acknowledging children as part of domestic abuse tended to sideline them as bystanders or as witnesses and not as the victims that they quite obviously are, and that the threshold for intervention was very much too high. We also found that a frequently targeted group for this kind of exploitation were children in care homes. And those are children in particular who are in unregulated care homes, which we found was quite a large percentage. And we called, firstly, for victims of domestic abuse who are children to be treated, to be designated as victims and not as bystanders and witnesses. And we called for all care homes of young people under 16 or over 16. They are just as likely to be exploited, to be regulated in a proper way. And we called for a strategic approach to how to deal with children who are victims of domestic abuse. As I say, this is intended to influence policy, and you will have guessed by now that it was directed particularly at the Domestic Abuse Bill, which was then going through the House of Commons and is about to start its passage through the House of Lords. So we asked that the Domestic Abuse Bill be amended to label children as victims in a case of domestic abuse. Now, clearly, we weren't alone in doing that, but it did succeed. And so if I move on to the second thing I wanted quickly to talk about, the Domestic Abuse Bill and children, let me celebrate the fact that the definition of victims in the Domestic Abuse Bill will now include children. And let me tell you one or two good things that will follow from that, but let me then sound a caution about something that's still missing from that bill for young people. So what has happened historically is that in the family courts in particular, because children are not designated as victims of domestic abuse, there is a presumption in every family case of shared parenting. Now that looks like something we would all wish. If a marriage has to break up, a partnership has to break up, we should all want both parents to be involved. However, if there is domestic abuse, one partner is perpetrating abuse on the other, and a child is seen merely as a bystander, then the presumption of shared parenting survives over the domestic abuse, however significant it is. So what's seen is what I call an oxymoron, which is that a partner can be simultaneously a perpetrator of domestic abuse against another partner and a good parent. Designating children as victims, which they undoubtedly are, as I say, the impact is far, far wide and very broadly reaching. That should remove that, and it should make it easier to get reality into the situation, which is some kind of rebuttable presumption that if there's shared parenting, absolutely fine, but if there's domestic abuse, set that aside and let's look at the nature of the abuse before compelling shared parenting. That designation of children as victims should also bring them better services widely in across the sector. But there is still a problem. So that was a very good move, which has been well driven. Good on the government for listening. But there is a statutory duty in the bill too, which is not really good enough. So there's a statutory duty in the bill on local authorities to provide refuge accommodation and to provide support, particularly for children, but for everybody who goes into refuge accommodation. Clearly, it's not just about a place to live. It's about the right therapy, the right counselling, the right input to help you start your life afresh after leaving. So that duty is likely to produce a two-tier impact on children. Most people who are victims of domestic abuse do not go into the refuge. Many, many, many of them stay at home. Yet cash-strapped local authorities who wish to support victims of domestic abuse, if they are compelled by statute to support refugees, will obviously have to spend their money there first and will not have probably any left for community-based resources. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner and I and many, many charities are campaigning, therefore, to broaden this statutory duty so that all victims of domestic abuse are subject to the local authority, the Police and Crime Commissioner, the health sector, a statutory duty on all of them to ensure good quality community-based support, just as well as good quality refuge-based support to rescue people from domestic abuse. So there's a good outcome in the domestic abuse bill, and there is one still to fight for as it goes through its House of Lords stages. Finally, I wanted to tell you about an aspect of how children should be being dealt with in the criminal justice system, which is beginning to improve, but on which there's still more to do. So if children make complaints, usually it's about sexual exploitation that this is germane to. What they will need to do is to make a statement of what happened to them. Obviously a very difficult thing to do, and it has been the ordinary practice for many years now that statement should be made on video, not a laboriously written down one by a police officer saying what happened next, but just try to encourage the child with questions, the young person, to talk to a camera about what happened. That's very good because that then acts as their evidence in a criminal trial, but of course they need to be cross-examined if their case is going to go to court. So there is a provision called Section 28 of the Youth Justice and Criminal Evidence Act. This is a statute that was passed in 1999, and this bit is just coming into force. And again, it is as a result of a lot of pressure that's been put on the court system and on the Ministry of Justice, in particular during COVID, because the position is that if a young person makes a video, they are now, bearing in mind the backlog of cases, which started off at 39,000 cases before COVID, and is now a backlog of, we think, around 42,000 trials. This means that a child who's made a video of their evidence will have to wait to be cross-examined on that video until the court can get round to it, and they do prioritise children cases. But with a backlog like that, you can think about a child living, the 8th year of their life, the 9th year of their life, whatever it is, with a case hanging over them under the shadow of what's happened and unable to escape. So Section 28 allows for the cross-examination of a child to be done in advance of the trial. So you have the tape of the original statement, you give that to the defence, they prepare their cross-examination, the points they want to put, and within a very short time they cross-examine the child, and that is done with them in the court with just the judge and 2 barristers, and the child at the end of a camera link being asked the questions. And then that's videoed too. And at that point, the child's engagement in the trial is over. The first video will be used for their first evidence. The second video, the cross-examination, will be used, and that is the evidence from the child. So if there's a year to wait before that case gets on, it's not a year that the child is waiting. The child has finished, has left, can get therapy for what's happened, can try and normalise their lives again, can move on. It is obviously hugely advantageous that of all people, children are not kept waiting for years for the courts to get through their backlog. Section 28 has been available since about 2016. It was piloted in a couple of centres and it did well, but it hasn't been spread nationwide, and that pressure has really been put now. We are saying to the Ministry of Justice, you're not using the courts for criminal jury trials at the moment because you can't manage the social distancing. They're getting better at that, but that still is the case. So use your empty courts to do these cross-examinations and get children out of the list. That is beginning to happen, and it is a very good thing. But spreading it nationwide, although the law's now been passed to allow for it, is not all that straightforward. Local courts are very self-determining, and not all of them have taken the point that once you do get it, it is essential to move kids along in a court context. And so let me just say this in conclusion. There was our report, and it made certain changes. There is still the need for a statutory duty. If you have a peer that you know, if you have an MP who you know, you can write to and ask the peers in that same party to take this case on. Then we can drive a statutory duty that means children in the community are looked after as well as those in the refuges. Now we've established them as victims. And if you have any contact in the court system, there is no reason why you can't just write and say, please implement Section 28 in your court as soon as it can possibly happen. So that's just a bit of a link between my own work and that of Embrace, which makes me feel confident, that I can contribute to this system of webinars, which I find a very impressive set of productions, having looked at one or two of them. And I want to congratulate Embrace on organising it and say that although this is the first time we have actively worked together, it is pretty obvious that we have a lot of interests in common when it comes to child victims of crime, and I look forward to working with you again. Congratulations once more on holding this system of webinars, and this work that you do is absolutely vital. Let us all pull together and ensure we do it as fully and as well as possible. Thank you very much.
Good morning, my name is NICOLA LESTER and I'm a clinical consultant, and this morning I'm going to be talking about developing trauma-informed services using the SENSE model. So the SENSE model was first developed in response to the Manchester bombing in May 2017 as part of my work with a Ministry of Justice funded project which provided support to victims of terror. It was actually originally intended as a way really of managing the large number of requests that were received from the organisation, from children, young people, adults and their families in the immediate aftermath of the attack. And perhaps most importantly, it helped us to develop a way of reducing the sense of overwhelm which was amongst professionals at the time and providing them with a structure to their response. Since then, the SENSE model has been adapted to be used across a range of different contexts, including overseas terrorist incidents in hostile environments such as Libya and Afghanistan, with hostages, and also specialist support organisations such as rape crisis and traumatic bereavement services. So making sense of trauma is comprised of 5 key stages. So the S is for stabilisation, the E for education, the N for normalisation, the S for social support, and the E for engagement. Essentially, it's derived from the 6 principles of trauma-informed practice, which I'm going to go on to talk about later in the presentation. And it was devised of these 5 interventions, which all of which have been recommended as best practice by the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence and also the broader trauma literature. So basically, in creating the word SENSE, the order of the letters in turn reflect the chronology in which the intervention should be offered. So, for example, immediately after an incident, the emphasis is on stabilisation to ensure the physical and emotional safety of those who've been affected and that their immediate needs are met. That's then followed by providing information and education about the signs and symptoms of trauma, essentially to try and promote an understanding of how trauma may affect an individual in an attempt to either normalise or to actually validate their experiences and to offer them reassurance. It's actually this normalisation of symptoms coupled with education which then introduces this idea of empowering the individual and their wider social support network to monitor their own symptoms and, where necessary, to then facilitate an early referral to formal psychological services. So the importance of social support in both reducing the impact of stressful life experiences and in protecting those affected from going on to develop disorders such as PTSD and other mental health difficulties is well established, suggesting that it's actually essential to assess the presence and availability of social support as the fourth stage of the intervention. And then the final stage is around engagement, so either encouraging engagement with specialist support services, promoting an individual's engagement with their wider social support network, or actually assisting them to re-engage with their own values and goals to regain a sense of purpose and control. So adopting a trauma-informed approach essentially provides a framework for organisations and professionals who are providing support to those affected by trauma, regardless of whether or not it's in the immediate aftermath or further down the line. And a trauma-informed approach is one that recognises the widespread impact of trauma and stress and the potential for re-traumatisation, and then it actively seeks to reduce this possibility by understanding what's needed to foster resilience and coping and to promote opportunities for recovery. Essentially, it's comprised of 5 key guiding principles which underpin practice, and these include safety, so ensuring physical and emotional safety; choice, responding to choice and control; facilitating connections; supporting coping; responding to identity and context; and building strengths. I'm going to now talk through each of these 6 principles in a little bit more detail to think about how these in themselves provide a framework for our support and intervention when we're working with those who've been affected by trauma. So safety, this can include both physical and emotional safety. But if we think about it in the context of creating emotional safety, what we're looking for people to do is to draw on those key components of those effective communication skills around being patient, being non-judgmental, being kind, consistent, honest, understanding, listening actively, and most importantly, bearing witness to distress. Bearing witness to distress is perhaps most challenging in the context of trauma, when it's that ability to bear witness to distress. And in doing so, we have to manage our own sense of helplessness and overwhelm when we're faced with the pain and distress of those that we're supporting and working with. So this idea of simply remaining present and engaged during these times can often be the hardest thing to do, but it's often the thing that's actually most needed from those that we're working with. The second principle is around choice, and this need to restore a sense of choice and control for those who are affected by trauma. Often when we're working with somebody who has experienced trauma, their sense of control has been significantly diminished and their choices have been taken away from them. And equally, it's essential to work in collaboration or partnership with someone, remembering that you're not doing things for or to someone, but you're doing things with them. And it's important to continue to promote their active engagement and participation in the recovery process. The third principle is about facilitating connections, and it's about taking the time to understand a person's networks of support and encouraging them to engage with them. As David Trickey, a clinical psychologist from the Anna Freud National Centre for Children and Families in London, said, people can really underestimate the importance and power of simple social support. So it's not only about taking the time to understand a person's network of support, but also encouraging them to connect with them as well. It's about developing a relationship which is based on reciprocity and trust, to ensure that our relationship with them and our involvement with them is both effective and is actually what's most needed by those that we're working with. The next principle is around supporting a person's capacity to cope. When dealing with trauma, it's important to remember that there is no right or wrong way of coping, and everybody's experience of trauma is completely unique. So it's about working within the boundaries of what somebody regards as tolerable and respecting those boundaries. Our role isn't to judge how someone is coping, but to meet them where they're at and not where we think they ought to be, and to support them to cope. And this involves working within their level of tolerance and, perhaps most importantly, prioritising their needs over what we need to do, or indeed what we feel we should be doing for them. And the fifth principle is about responding to and accounting for identity and context. So it's thinking about who you're working with in terms of their gender, their background and family, their religious beliefs, political affiliations, and their circumstances. And ultimately, it's about not making assumptions about what this might mean to the person, and instead taking the time to explore with them how they're making sense of their experience of trauma and the world around them. And finally, the sixth principle is around building strengths. So here we're reminded of people's innate resilience and strength, of their ability to demonstrate courage and determination in some of the most challenging and painful of circumstances. And remembering this and focusing on someone's capacity to cope and recognising and acknowledging their enduring strength is an essential part of any trauma-informed approach. So when we think about using the SENSE model to structure trauma-informed care, what we're looking for it to do is to provide us with an early intervention approach which both provides support to individuals and their families. It's underpinned by the principles of trauma-informed practice, so therefore our focus is on supporting coping and identification of their support needs and also promoting access to relevant longer-term care. It's about providing that immediate stabilisation by identifying and addressing practical and emotional needs together. And ultimately, it's about providing us with a framework in which to establish and manage relationships in the delivery of a time-limited intervention. I'm going to talk through each of the 5 stages in a little bit more detail to think about what these stages actually mean in terms of the type of support interventions that we would be looking to deliver at these key stages. So stage 1 is all around stabilisation, and that's about addressing immediate practical and emotional needs, asking some of those really basic questions that sometimes we overlook. For example, what do you need and what would be most helpful at the current time? Sometimes when someone has experienced a traumatic incident, they may find it very difficult to identify what it is that they need. And even when someone doesn't know how to articulate their needs, giving them choices and options is really important. If someone isn't sure what they need, more often than not, they're able to tell you what they don't need. And at this stage, it's also just as important to focus on emotional support needs as well as practical support needs, because often we find that those affected by trauma are impacted by both of those needs. Stage 2 is all around education, so really helping people to understand and recognise how they feel. And this links us to stage 3, this normalisation stage, which is where we're looking for that information and understanding to provide reassurance that responses to a trauma, no matter what those responses are, no matter how someone is coping, they're normal and they're to be expected. When we think about stages 2 and 3 together, so this education and normalisation, what we're looking to do is to provide a safe and non-judgmental space for someone to discuss how they're feeling, to really promote this idea that there's no right or wrong way of coping and that our role is to support and enhance however someone is coping, reminding the person that they're coping in the best way they know how. And ultimately to start our engagement with someone by understanding someone's way of coping, asking how is this helpful to them. And it's really only after developing a relationship with somebody that we might even be able to start to think about exploring different coping strategies in a safe and supportive way. Stage 4 around social support is very much linked to this idea of facilitating connections as one of those key principles of a trauma-informed approach to practice. So this is thinking about facilitating connections with family, friends and wider support networks. Here we're looking for interventions to focus on identifying sources of support, and this can be anything from people, places, animals and activities, anything that the person that you're working with identifies as supporting them to cope, and then considering how access to this type of support can be strengthened and enhanced. In terms of thinking about identifying sources of social support, what we're looking to do is to try and identify who or even what is a positive source of support. And this can be family, friends, professionals, other members of the community, as well as places, animals and activities. Asking questions around how and why they're supportive, what do they offer that's helpful, and then thinking about how best this support can be accessed. Moving on to the 5th stage, this is all around engagement. So this final stage of the model is focused on promoting a person's engagement with sources of support and activities that they find meaningful and beneficial. And this could include both formal and informal support, such as things like psychology and psychiatry services, as well as engaging in other activities like yoga, meditation, sports, arts and crafts in recognition of their therapeutic effect and the ways in which such activities may support coping and also increase a person's access to sources of social support within the wider community. And it's really at this stage as well that we're looking to work in collaboration to explore someone's needs and interests and considering whether or not this engagement stage needs to be extended to support someone's wider social support network as well. The aim here is to create a personalised support plan, which is comprised of information about resources and services which are relevant and appropriate. There can often actually be a wide range of national and local services which provide different types of support, but they can be difficult to navigate, particularly when somebody has been affected by trauma, because their sense of overwhelm is particularly high, and trying to navigate these services may lead to confusion. So a personalised support plan then enables us to promote access and engagement and to reduce overwhelm and confusion, and it helps to structure this support and allow for a person-centred and collaborative approach with opportunities to regularly review their needs. Just to take the opportunity to say thank you for listening to a summary of the SENSE model, and if anybody has any questions about the model or about trauma-informed practice, please feel free to email me on the contact details listed. Thank you again for your time.
Hi everyone. So my colleague Kim Harrison spoke previously, and I'm Claire John Bocas. I'll work alongside Kim at Slater and Gordon. So we both deal with civil cases and also CICA cases. So I'm here to speak about the CICA scheme, a little bit about how it works, and a little bit about the changes that are hopefully coming forward as well. So as I mentioned, Kim spoke previously about one form of civil remedy where children have suffered physical and or sexual abuse, but in some cases it may be possible to pursue a civil claim, and in other cases it may not be possible to pursue a civil claim against an institution that's responsible. It may be that the abuse has been committed by a family member, for example. So the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority is a government-funded organisation that was created to provide compensation for blameless victims of violent crime, which includes physical and sexual abuse. The scheme covers a wide variety of situations, and I've acted on behalf of victims of physical attacks, sexual abuse, families of the Manchester Arena terror attack, and also where children have lost a parent due to homicide. So the latest version of the scheme was incepted in 2012, with the last formal update being made in June 2019. So the scheme sets out strict eligibility criteria. For example, where someone suffers abuse as a child and it's reported to the police as a child, they have 2 years from their 18th birthday to make an application. So this expires when they turn 20 years old. Where the abuse is reported as an adult, an application must be submitted within 2 years of a report being made to the police. And cases can be successful even where the perpetrator hasn't been convicted, but it is important to be aware of those time limits existing for an application. So awards are calculated via a tariff-based system, which in its simplest form is a really large table with a column of injuries on the left-hand side and a column of set awards on the right-hand side. The types of injuries are then broken down with dedicated sections for physical injuries such as broken limbs. Physical abuse of children is also covered within the scheme, which takes account of whether the assaults are considered isolated or intermittent, and whether the abuse is classified by the CICA as serious or severe. And again, for where the abuse is a persistent repetitive pattern, which is very difficult to say. Dedicated sections of the scheme also cover where sexual abuse has been suffered either as a child or as an adult. The scheme sets out the different types of sexual assaults which may have occurred, and also the period of time the assaults occurred for. for example, whether this is one incident or two or more incidents or a pattern, and the pattern looks at whether that's up to 3 years or over 3 years. So as well as the physical and sexual abuse side of things, mental injuries are also taken into account, and it's whether the mental injury has been caused as a result of the physical or sexual abuse. Now, under the scheme, it is quite a high threshold for these types of awards to be made, as there is a requirement that this is confirmed by a diagnosis or prognosis of a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist. So where the mental injury has been caused due to sexual abuse, which has been suffered, an applicant would not receive both an award for the sexual assault and the mental injury. An award would only be made for whichever was the highest under the tariff. Other parts of the scheme looking at physical abuse can take account of multiple injuries. So where an award is received from the CICA, there is the opportunity to consider if the award is appropriate, and an award can be appealed first to the CICA to review and consider again, and following this to a tribunal panel. And I've taken cases in front of the tribunal panel and been able to obtain a higher award than the CICA first put forward. So it is possible, and it's a good mechanism to be used if needed. Unfortunately, the scheme does not set out timescales for awards to be considered, and the more complex cases can take longer to go through the application process. So, as I mentioned as well at the start, the most recent version of the scheme is the 2012 version, and although updates have been made to the scheme, there are calls for the scheme to be fully updated, as many of the awards and criteria haven't changed since 2012. Recent changes have included the removal of the pre-1979 same roof rule, which prevented those who had been abused by a perpetrator who lived in the same household being able to apply to the scheme for compensation. In May this year, the Victims Commissioner met with the CEO of the CICA, Linda Brown, and one point which was discussed was regarding the application process, especially for survivors of sexual assaults, who often feel re-traumatised by having to set out the full details of the abuse in the application form. A pilot of test cases looked at whether this would cause any delays if this was to be removed, and the pilot was deemed a success. So as of the 14th of May, survivors of sexual crimes will no longer be asked to set out in their own words what had happened, and can provide a crime number, location details and approximate dates or times, so that the CICA can rely on the evidence that's contained in the police records. In July this year, the government also launched a consultation regarding the current 2012 scheme, and the review is to assess whether the scheme remains fit for purpose, reflects the changing nature of violent crime, and effectively supports victims in their recovery. Feedback from the public, victims and survivors, victims groups and academics, and clinical experts and other professionals has been requested. And as members of APIL, which is the Association for Personal Injury Lawyers, we are also in the process of submitting our response based on our clients' experiences. The Victims Commissioner has highlighted that currently no agency is responsible for providing information about the scheme to victims, or that the scheme even exists. So it becomes a bit of a postcode lottery as to if the police do mention the scheme to the survivor that they're working with, and therefore many people are unaware of the scheme's existence at all. Although no amount of money can compensate for the experiences someone has gone through, many find that the scheme does help provide a form of closure and recognition, especially where a conviction hasn't been possible, especially looking at what has happened, and to enable them to move on to the next stages of their life as well. That is just a brief overview of what the scheme is and the technicalities behind it. But if anyone does have any questions or wants any help or advice, I'm happy to be contacted by email or phone, and we can leave our email details with you as well. That's all from me.
Well, what an inspiring session this has been. I'm sure we will have received a number of questions. So over now to Anne, the CEO of Embrace.
Well, thank you, Claire, Nikki, and of course, Dame Vera, for a most insightful set of presentations this morning. I can't believe quite how quickly we've come to the end of our series of webinars, which I hope you all agree have been really valuable in looking into the aspects of support for children harmed by crime. We have a short time for questions, but before we go there, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone for registering and listening in. Do remember that all the presentations are available on demand, and to our sponsors for making it all happen. Our overall sponsors, Slater & Gordon, and our day sponsors, Celerity, CanCom, and of course our media partner, Policing Insight. And of course I mustn't forget CFENT for providing the platform for our webinars today. So the first question is directed to Dame Vera, who has asked that questions be emailed to her, and she mentioned garnering further support for changes in the legislation regarding children being considered as victims of crime in cases of domestic abuse. A really interesting input there. We've been asked for a template of the letters which Dame Vera has requested be sent to MPs and the Lords. We will look for further information on that, and I'm sure we'll come back with a full answer, because the more we can lobby together, the louder our voice will be. We also have a question here for our final speaker today, that's Claire. We've got a question asking, how do referrers of children to Embrace also access the support from Slater & Gordon, i.e. parents or guardians needing legal advice? Claire, how do they do that?
Well, there is a direct referral process on the Embrace website, which will put the referral straight in touch with ourselves. So the Embrace website is set up to accommodate for that. So that's probably one of the easiest ways.
Yes, it certainly is, Claire. Our encrypted referral form is on our website, and there is an option to tick a box for those requiring help from lawyers. So thanks for raising that and answering that question too. It does appear that we've actually run out of time for our series and also for this section of Q&As. But the questions that have come in and continue to come in, we will do our best to answer all of those by email. And finally from me, thank you so much for listening, taking part, and hopefully we can see you all again soon. Thank you.